Today's scripture reading will be Mark 14:27. I repeat, Mark 14:27. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered."
We're glad you're here today. Mary reminded me before I start this morning that I really should let you guys know the result of some of the prayers that you are praying. My brother's treatment for the recurring liver cancer is supposed to begin this Wednesday, June the 1st. This is the second time that they've had to do this particular procedure, and about 2 years ago they did it, and we're hoping for good results this time as well. And then the other prayer request that I had given you was for a friend of mine, Denny France. His parents been longtime friends of mine. Denny is 45 years old. He was born with spina bifida. He's never walked a day of his life. He's always had to be carried or put in a wheelchair. The doctors didn't believe that he would survive his teenage years, and now he's 45 years old. He's been in the hospital for the last couple of weeks with pneumonia and complications, which, given his medical condition, are really severe anyway. And it was not certain that he was going to survive, but I got a call yesterday afternoon that he's doing so much better that the doctors are sending him home tomorrow. So keep up the prayers. But we are involved in a study of the Gospel of Mark. We're calling it Following Jesus through the Gospel of Mark. And we've come to Mark chapter 14. And we're going to talk about some tests that the apostles took, some of the disciples took the last day of Jesus' life. I don't know what you think about tests. I've always done well on tests. It's not because I'm smarter, it's just because I'm a good test taker. And for example, when I took the bar exam, I never thought I would pass the first time, and I did, and I was as surprised as anybody. My study partner, on the other hand, who really knew the law a lot better than I did, and she could analyze things a lot better than I could, but she had to take the bar a couple of times. And the difference between the two of us is simply that I'm a better test taker. Some people are good at taking tests and other people are not. So I just think that's a really interesting thing that we are that way. But just think about yourself. How are you at taking tests? Because the fact of the matter is that you and I do occasionally undergo tests. And not just tests of subject matter, but tests of our character, tests of our spirit, tests that are kind of custom designed for us by God. He gives us tests so that we can see where we're weak and where we're strong and where we need to improve. And, we can benefit by those tests. Well, we're going to look at 4 specific tests that the disciples had in the Gospel of Mark. And the fact is they fail every one of them. And if the Gospel of Mark was written to evoke a lasting response in word and deed to the identity of Jesus, then Mark 14 stands as a reminder that those who should have been best equipped to pass the tests were the ones who in fact failed. And the ones who should have been least equipped to pass the tests were the ones that succeeded. Let's take a look at those. The first is a test of priority. It's in Mark 14, verses 1 through 11. 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the chief priests and experts in the law were trying to find a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, so there won't be a riot among the people. I want to make a couple of comments here before we go with the rest of the reading. When you read about the chief priests and the scribes in the Gospel of Mark, you need to understand these are the folks who were the professional theologians. They were the ones who were the employed people at the temple. And because they controlled the flow of the money that was given at the temple, they were very wealthy. In fact, when they've excavated the city of David, they've excavated the homes of the high priests in the first century. And these are folks who lived a cut above everybody else. we really don't have a frame of reference, probably, unless we were to compare, for example, the religious hierarchy in a church like the Catholic Church, where the priests who operate among the people live in a very impoverished, lower form of existence, where those who live in the upper echelons live a much more lavish lifestyle. And that's what's going on here. The people who are in control of the temple are the chief priests, and the experts in the law are the ones called the scribes. They're the theological teachers. They're the ones who are teaching people what to believe about the Scriptures. And the Scripture says they were trying to find a way to arrest Jesus. That's what's called an imperfect tense. Imperfect tense is one of those tenses where it just says they kept trying, they kept looking for ways to arrest Jesus. It wasn't just, let's find a way to arrest him. They were constantly looking for a way to trap him. We've seen that in the Gospel of Mark so far. But they were concerned because Jerusalem, and I thought it was interesting today seeing the video that Bob brought to us in class. The city of Jerusalem today, the old city, has about 35,000 inhabitants. That's about the same number of inhabitants that it had in the first century, about 35,000. But when Passover came, that would swell to something like 300,000. And because the Passover had to be eaten in the city, this small confined area that was supposed to house about 35,000 people suddenly has a population 10 times its size. So you can understand why the chief priests and the scribes are concerned about the possibility of a riot. Because you've got all these people from all over the world who've come into to Jerusalem for the Passover, and they're there believing that just as God intervened once before in the days of Moses and the Exodus, He's going to intervene once again. A Messiah is going to come, and every year when they gather for Passover, they think, is this the year? Going on with our reading. Now, while Jesus was in Bethany, that's about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, at the house of Simon the leper, reclining at the table, a woman came in with an alabaster jar of costly aromatic oil from pure nard. After breaking open the jar, she poured it on his head, but some who were present indignantly said to one another, "Why this waste of expensive ointment? It could have been sold for more than 300 silver coins and the money given to the poor." So they spoke angrily to her. Have you ever noticed that sometimes when you read through the Scriptures, you kind of read through it fairly quickly and you really don't stop and think about the things that are being said? Had you ever thought about this business of Jesus being in the home of a leper? Because you recall, the lepers were supposed to stay away from everybody else. They were supposed to cover their faces and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." And for Jesus to eat in the house of a leper, that tells us that probably this guy used to be a leper, but he's not anymore. Maybe the reason is because Jesus healed him. But this woman comes in with this jar of perfume, and she breaks it over his head, and the disciples are concerned about this waste. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She's done a good service for me. For you will always have the poor with you, and you can do good for them whenever you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She anointed my body beforehand for burial. I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus into their hands. When they heard this, they were delighted and promised to give him money. So Judas began looking for an opportunity to betray him. John tells us that it was Judas who raised the issue about the waste of this ointment. Matthew tells us it was the disciples who were upset. So you've got the disciples who are the ones that are saying, "Why this waste?" And they're concerned ostensibly for the poor. I mean, we could have taken this money and put it in the treasury and taken care of the poor. Well, here you've got this setting. Jerusalem's normal population, swells to maybe 10 times its normal population. The people coming to Jerusalem to remember a time when God intervened in history. And the Jewish leaders are concerned about this possible riot. In fact, Josephus tells us that a few years after this particular incident, there was a riot in Jerusalem during Passover, and 30,000 Jews were literally crushed to death in this huge riot that took place. So you can understand why the chief priests and the scribes are concerned about it. And against that backdrop, we have these two vignettes. The first is the woman with the alabaster jar. This is a picture of a first century Jewish alabaster jar. It's been excavated. We don't know what hers looked like. It probably had a long, narrow neck instead of a flared out neck like that. But this alabaster jar was formed so that the perfume was inside and the top was sealed over so that it had to be broken in order to be used. So once you break that jar, you have to use all of the oil at once. And this was not inexpensive oil. 300 silver coins. The silver coin in the Net Bible translation is a denarius. A denarius was 1 day's wage for a day's work. Now, by the time you take into consideration Sabbaths when you couldn't work, and holidays when you couldn't work, 300 days' wages was a year's salary. Now, I don't know what you earn, but can you imagine buying a bottle of perfume that was worth a year's salary? I'm not going to ask for anybody to raise their hands. That's what we're talking about here. That's a lot of money. And I've read this story before and kind of glossed over that. And then sometimes when I thought about it, I thought, wow, that is a lot of money. If I'd been there with the disciples, and let me tell you this, church leaders all over the world, if they'd been there when this happened, they would have said exactly what Judas said. What are you doing wasting a year's salary on one use of this oil? Judas, John tells us, is the treasurer of the group. And John 12:4 says it was Judas who voiced the objection. And so what he says is, we should have put this money, we should have sold it and put the money into the treasury. For what purpose, Judas? Well, we could have helped the poor with it. I can't tell you how many churches I've seen that have treasuries with money in them so that they can help the poor that they never seem to get around to helping. But here's this woman who recognizes who Jesus is. And she pours this extravagant gift of perfume on his head. And the disciples, on the other hand, who ought to know who Jesus is, are the ones who are grumbling and complaining. This unnamed woman responds appropriately to the identity of Jesus, even though his closest followers didn't. They failed the test. As a matter of fact, here's a woman who's so preoccupied with Jesus that nothing else matters, and the disciples who are so preoccupied with the stuff that this world offers that they forget what Jesus has been telling them is going to happen in Jerusalem. I don't think it's an accident that both Matthew and Mark go right from the story of the woman with the alabaster jar into the story of Judas betraying Jesus. And when you understand that Judas is the treasurer and Judas is the one who's complaining, according to John, it makes sense. This is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for Judas. He just throws up his hands in despair and says, I might as well get if we can't get the $300, then I can at least get 30. And he goes and talks to the treasurer, to the temple leaders. Now, everybody knew where to find the chief priests, but can you imagine getting an audience with them? That would be like saying, I'm going to go to Rome and have an audience with the Pope. It isn't going to happen. But in this case, it did happen because the chief priests and experts in the law are looking for a way to get Jesus. And Judas comes and offers it to them. So the contrast between the woman who's otherwise unknown and Judas and the disciples who've been around with Jesus for 3 years. She broke the flask and poured it over his head. You know, there are all kinds of things vying for our preoccupation. The disciples are preoccupied with money, thinking that, well, if we have this money, we can do good with this money. And it should make us think, what are our preoccupations that steal our attention away from Jesus? Are you preoccupied with money? Are you preoccupied with the poor? How about with your family? How about evangelism? How about the Bible? This woman realized the only thing that's really important is Jesus. Everything else is peripheral. And preoccupation with anything other than Jesus tells you your priorities are wrong and you need to rearrange them. We go to the second test. This one's a test of pride. Mark 14, verses 12 to 31. Now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened